Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, we hear acclaimed Israeli-British historian Avi Shlaim about his unique memoir from the lost world of Arab Jews. He was just 5 years old when antisemitic violence following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War forced his family to flee their beloved Iraq to live in a newly created Israel. Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, this episode explores the disappearing heritage of Arab Jews caught in the crossfire of secular ideologies.
Thank you. My name is Mark David Baer. I'm a professor of international history at the London School of Economics. And tonight, I have the pleasure to be in conversation with Avi Shlaim, who's emeritus professor at Oxford University. And those of you who follow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will certainly be well aware. I'm sure you've already read two of his, if not three of his very important books. Of course, he has written an intense. How long is your Iron Wall? How long?
It's 900 pages, and I give people two pieces of advice. One, don't buy it, and two, if you buy it, don't drop it on your foot.
Along with that book, which I read as an undergraduate, also is your very well received biography of King Hussein of Jordan, which also continues his interrogation of Israel's foreign policy and Israel's relations with its neighbors. But tonight, I think what we're going to talk about is this splendid biography, which I've read twice now. Again, I had a look at while I come up here on the train, and it's a brilliant work because it's really quite polemical. It makes a very strong political argument, but it does so in a very gentle way. It's making a very important argument about a lot of things through the window of his own life story. And his life story has been remarkable, and I was upset that the book only goes until he's 18, right? So 300 pages about the first 18 years of his life. And I said, will there be a part two? He said no. But I want to start out by asking about the title that you chose. Because in the title is 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. I want to ask you about this phrase, Arab Jew. What do you mean by that? Why did you use it, and why is it important?
So the 3 worlds of the title are Baghdad, where I lived up to the age of 5, Ramat Gan, a town in Israel near Tel Aviv, where I went to school from 5 to 15, and London, where I went to the Jewish Free School from the age of 15 to 18. And the book stops when I'm 18, but there is a long epilogue which traces the evolution of my attitude towards Israel and Zionism right up to the present. And my wife, Gwyn, who is with me here, read the book chapter by chapter as I was writing. And when she got to chapter 5, she said to me, I'm very worried. I'm on chapter 5 and you weren't born yet. And I said to her, that's the whole point. The book isn't about me. I'm not a particularly important or an interesting person, but I lived in interesting times. I lived in an Arab country among Muslims. I lived through the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. And my family moved from an Arab country, Iraq, to Israel. So these were very interesting times. A lot happened in Jewish history. And I deliberately chose the subtitle is Memoir of an Arab Jew, because, as you know, this is a very controversial term. In Israel, it's very much resented. You can be a French Jew, you can be a Hungarian Jew, a Romanian Jew, a Brazilian Jew, but if you say, you can even be a German Jew, despite the association with the Holocaust. But if you say I'm an Arab Jew, you immediately get challenged, and Israelis would say to you, that's an impossibility, it's a contradiction in terms. You can't be an Arab Jew. If you are a Jew, you can't be an Arab, and if you're an Arab, you can't be a Jew. And I beg to differ. I don't want Israelis to impose an identity on me. In Iraq, we were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. Our cuisine was Arab cuisine. Our culture was Arab culture. My parents' music was a very nice blend of Jewish and Arabic music. So I can think of no better way to define myself as a young boy, to define my identity than that of an Arab Jew. So I insist that there is such a thing, but Zionism tried to erase the notion of an Arab Jew, but I still cling to it, and I think it's a meaningful concept.
Right.
And what I try to do in the book is to recreate the world of Arab Jews as I and my family experienced it.
Right. So let's go back to Baghdad. So you're born in 1945 in Baghdad. So describe for us what your life was like for those first 5 years when you lived in Iraq. What kind of life did Iraqi Jews, what kind of life did your family have?
So we weren't a typical Jewish family in Baghdad. There was a very large Jewish community of about 135,000 Jews.
So that's about almost half of Baghdad's population, perhaps?
A third.
A third, okay.
And Baghdad was often described as a Jewish city. In the First World War, the Jews were a third of the population, and on the Jewish high holidays, the market was closed, shops were closed, the banks were closed. So it was the Jews were very prominent in Baghdad.
And the Jewish population goes back a long time.
The Jewish population in Baghdad goes back to the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. So we were not newcomers.
Right.
We certainly weren't intruders. We were there long before the rise of Islam in the 7th century.
Right.
There were Jews at every level. There were very poor Jews, and there were working class Jews. Right. There were craftsmen. There were even a few, but not many, Jewish farmers. Then there was a large Jewish middle class and very wealthy, solid middle class. And we were upper middle class. My father was a very rich merchant with a very high social status. He had a store in which he sold building materials, particularly very smart bathroom sets from Britain. And it was a very conservative society and patriarchal society, and it was corrupt. So he knew many of the ministers, and even the king, King Faisal I, was one of his customers when he built a castle for himself. And ministers would come and buy on credit building materials for the houses that they built, and he never chased them to pay up their bills. But then they made it compensated him by giving him government contracts.
Right.
So it was a very corrupt system, but not vicious. People didn't disappear from the streets. Mm-hmm. People weren't tortured, as happened after the Ba'ath came to power in 1968. Mm-hmm. We led a very contented life, a life of luxury. My mother was 17 years old. Mm-hmm. She was a schoolgirl.
But your father was much older.
He was 42, and it was an arranged marriage.
Right.
Not an arranged marriage. She didn't want to get married. She was forced by her family to marry this very wealthy, eligible bachelor who had a wonderful villa. And she was a schoolgirl. She went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a network of Jewish schools throughout the Ottoman Empire. And Mark is a leading expert on the Ottoman Empire. And in her school, the teaching language was French, the medium of teaching was French, but they also learned English, Hebrew, and Arabic. And my mother died in Israel, age 96, 2 years ago. But when in her 90s anyone dared suggest that she was dementing, she would declaim Archimedes' law in French. So it was a very luxurious and comfortable.
And quite privileged. You were quite privileged. And in the book, you describe these amazing food. And you would go on a boat to an island and you'd have this picnic. But describe that for us, because you really take us into Baghdad in the late 1940s.
My mother was a lady of leisure. And in the summer, we would, a lot of Jews and some of my mother's uncles, one of her uncles, had a boat and a boatman, and we would go on an outing on the Tigris River, and we had a Muslim boatman who would buy a big fish in the wharf, and then he wouldn't kill the fish. They wouldn't kill the fish for him. They would tie it to the boat and drag it and take us to the island.
So it's fresh. It stays fresh, right? Yeah.
And then the boatman would get out a sharp knife and cut up the fish, fill it with spices, with tomatoes and onions. And this is a famous Jewish delicacy. It's called masguf, barbecued fish, barbecued on a fire, on a spit. And the pleasure of eating it was greatly increased by eating it in our hands rather than on a plate. Mm-hmm. So that was quite typical of the kind of leisurely life, luxurious life, I would say Sybaritic style lifestyle. But my editor in One World counted that I used the adjective Sybaritic 6 times.
Now, do you think you're I mean, it also sounds a bit nostalgic and it sounds a bit perfect in a way. But there were tensions and there were problems. I mean, you were the son and you had 2 sisters, and your parents went out of the way to lavish their, praise on you to the detriment of your sisters, right?
So boys were greatly preferred to girls in Baghdad, in the Jewish community in those days, because boys didn't involve the honor of the family, and they grew up to be breadwinners, whereas girls were regarded as a liability, almost a curse, because if they met with a Muslim, they could dishonor the family. So there's the honor of the family at stake, and girls were expected not to have a good education, not to be independent, but to marry a Jewish boy and bring up a family. And my grandmother, who lived with us in Baghdad, used to say to my sisters, Avi huwa al-asal wa antum qshur al-basal. Avi is the honey and you are the peels of the onion. And I was too young to understand what was going on, the family dynamics. It's only when I grew up that I realized how privileged I was and how disadvantaged my sisters were. So I apologized to them and I tried to make it up to them in any way I could, and they say they forgave me because it wasn't my fault.
Now, in the book, you dedicate the book to your sisters and to your mother and your grandmother. So there was a series of strong women in your life that, despite everything, your mother, despite having to marry at 17 against her will, it's actually a very independent, feisty character as she emerges in this book.
Very strong women in the family, and my wife, Gwyn, is the one who suggested I was going to dedicate this book to her, but she said, no, dedicate it to, and she suggested the wording, the book is dedicated to the women who accompanied me on the journey. That's mostly my grandmother, Ida, my mother, and my two sisters, Dalia and Vilma. But my grandmother was a very, very strong character, and so was my mother. My mother was 17 when she got married, but she was and she didn't want to get married, but she was very pragmatic, and once she was married, she made the most of it and led the life of a lady of leisure. But when we lost our wealth in the transition to Israel, my father was a broken man.
Yeah.
He tried 2 business ventures, and he was cheated, and he was unemployed until he died. Whereas my mother was very resourceful. I think women in general are more resourceful than men. And when the money ran out, she became a telephonist in the town hall, and she became the breadwinner.
Right.
So yes, very strong. And also, I was a Dumbo. I didn't have any talents, and every year at school, the teachers wanted me to repeat the year, but my mother wouldn't let them. She would fight for me and tell them to give me another chance, and she promised them I would do good in the end. So I owed a lot to my mother.
Absolutely. So the first third of the book is about life in Iraq, and it's rather nostalgic, it's rather positive, it's rather a positive depiction. But then something went wrong, because the Jews of Iraq left. So tell us, if life was so good for Jews in Iraq, what happened at the end of the 1940s? I mean, what external factors made it so that the category Arab Jew disappeared?
2 things happened. The rise of Arab nationalism and the rise of Jewish nationalism or Zionism at the same time. After the First World War, in the interwar period. So there was a long tradition of religious tolerance in Iraq. The Jews were one minority among many minorities. Right. Assyrians, Catholic, Chaldeans, Turkomans, Circassians. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem. Europe had a Jewish problem. Right. In Europe, Jews lived in ghettos. And in Iraq, the Jews didn't live in ghettos, and they covered all the professions, and Iraq didn't have a Jewish problem until the rise of nationalism. The nationalist Iraqis started singling out the Jews as the problem, and the Jews who had been a pillar of Iraqi society were identified increasingly as a 5th column. And Zionism gave the Jews, for the first time in history, a territorial base. There was a Jewish state, Israel, and it was easier to say to Jews in Iraq or Egypt or Syria or Lebanon, you don't belong here. You're outsiders. You belong with the Zionists, your brothers. So if you don't like it here, why don't you go and join your Zionist brothers in Palestine? And there was another issue. Zionism, after the First World War, staged the systematic takeover of Palestine. And this process culminated in the 1948 war, the establishment of the State of Israel, which involved a monumental injustice to the Palestinians. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians, more than half the Arab population, were made refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. And this provoked a lot of hostility and a backlash against the Jews throughout the Arab lands. This is what happened.
And some of these Iraqi nationalists were influenced by the Nazis. And there was a pogrom against Jews in Baghdad in 1941, right, when several hundred Jews were killed. Now, there's also the issue of British imperialism, British colonialism. Now, your family actually had British citizenship. So again, your family is unusual, not only being part of the elite and being wealthy, but also then you had, in a sense, a way out. How did your family also have British citizenship, or parts of your family?
I asked my mother, what is your identity? She said, I am 100% Iraqi, but I had an extra thing. I was also British. My family, my mother's side of the family, had British citizenship because her father was born in India, in Bombay, under the Raj. So he was British by birth. But when he was a teenager, his family moved back to Baghdad. And in Baghdad, he was a translator, and he worked for the British consulate in Baghdad. So the family had a close connection with the British authorities. And one of my uncles, my mother's elder brother, Isaac Shalom Meir Obadiah. Here, if you want to say something, is easy. You say, and Bob is your uncle, and Bob is your uncle. I say, and Isaac Shalom Meir Obadiah is your uncle. And in 1942, he was a merchant. He used to import whiskey from Scotland. And in 1942, he went to the British consulate and applied for a visa to go to Britain. And he filled in a form. And then the clerk said to him, wait, the consul wants to talk to you. So you're summoned to meet the consul. And the consul said to him, Mr. Obadiah, we are very impressed with your knowledge of languages. We would like to offer you a commission. And my uncle thought, he almost asked, how much?
What percent do I get?
What
right?
percent?
That was a deal. He didn't know it was a military commission.
And he said, that would be very nice. And the consul went away and brought a wad of forms, and my uncle started filling them, and gradually it dawned on him.
Signing up for
this. It was a commission to join the British Army, but he went through with it, and he became a lieutenant in the British intelligence, but he never had any training. He became an interpreter in the British and so did his other brother, Saleh. So the whole community, the whole family had British passports.
And then they settled in England after the war, right?
My uncle Isaac Shalom Meir Obadiah, after the war, he could be asked to be demobilized anywhere he wanted, and he asked to be demobilized in London.
Right, okay. So there is that connection as well. Now, so 1945, you're born. 1948, Israel is created. Then in 1950, most Iraqi Jews end up in Israel. And the most explosive, it's a pun, but the most explosive chapter in your book is what is it? Use the word bomb, don't you?
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7, which is probably the chapter that's going to get you into the most controversy. Baghdad bombshell. Now, why is it that the Jews of Iraq left Iraq in that time period, around 1950?
So, after the 1948 war, there was a backlash against the Jews. There was great hostility at a popular level. People really resented the Jews and resented what the Zionists had done in Palestine. And some Palestinian refugees from Palestine arrived in Iraq.
And they couldn't distinguish between Iraqi Jews, Israeli Jews? They thought the Iraqi Jews were the same?
The Iraqi nationalists refused to distinguish. They were one and the same. So there was popular hostility, but also, and more importantly, there was official persecution of the Jews after the war, led by the government. Right. The government didn't follow the street. The government led the hostility towards the Jews and persecuted the Jews. This took many forms. Jews were dismissed from government service. Restrictions were placed on Jewish merchants and what they could do. Restrictions were placed on Jewish bankers. And also there were quotas for Jewish. It became more difficult for young Jews to go to colleges and to acquire qualifications.
And there was also blackmail and kidnapping, and there was executions of some leading figures in the community, right?
Yes. Policemen could arrest Jews on trumped-up charges, and one of them was that they were Zionists. And Zionism became a criminal offense in 1948, and there was a lot of arrests of wealthy Jews to extract money from them rather than because they were supporting Zionism. And one very famous, very rich, the richest Jew in Basra, Shafiq Adas, who was extremely well connected, was arrested and tried on trumped-up charges of selling weapons to Israel, and he was friends with the regent, and everyone thought it'd be impossible, but the regent didn't intervene, and he was executed, he was hanged, and all his property was confiscated. So this was a signal that life was no longer safe for Jews.
But there were bombings of synagogues as well. But who was responsible for those bombings?
In March 1950, the government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register. And very few Iraqis chose to register to leave because they were Iraqis. They didn't have any other country. There wasn't the lure of Zion. There wasn't the ideological attraction of going to Israel. So very few registered. And it's important to stress that those Jews who wanted to leave could only go to Israel. They couldn't go anywhere else. They had no option because it's a one-way visa to leave Iraq, and only Israel would take them, and Israel arranged the transport. So in the first year, very few Iraqis opted to go to Israel, and then 5 bombs exploded in Jewish sites. And by the end of 1952, 125,000 out of 135,000 Iraqi Jews ended up in Israel. And it's not part of my argument that the bombs were the main reason for the exodus. All I say is that it was a factor which has to be taken into account. Moreover, that the Zionist underground, under orders and direction from the Mossad, was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs.
Well, this is outrageous. This is absolutely outrageous, because the argument in Israel is that Jews had no place in Muslim countries in the Arab world because they were always persecuted, they're always subject to violence and anti-Semitism. But then if Israel is bombing the synagogues, it just, it's shocking, really shocking. So how have people responded to this chapter in the book?
Well, some British Jews have written blogs. Lynn Julius wrote a review in the Jewish Chronicle, and she said that this is outrageous, what I say, that it was Iraqi anti-Semitism that forced the Jews out, and here I come and say, yes, there was some anti-Semitism, but Israel also played a part in the Exodus. And she says that I misrepresent Iraqi history, but I don't. I tell Iraqi history as objectively as I can, warts and all. There are lights, there are shadows as well as lights in the story, and I don't try to deny that. But I insist that I now have undeniable evidence of Israeli involvement in the bombs. And I argue that this wasn't a one-off. It was part of a pattern of what I call, or someone else called, cruel Zionism. It's part of a pattern of false flag operations involving the Mossad and local Jews. And the other more famous example of a false flag operation is the Lavon affair. In 1954, Jews planted bombs in a cinema to try and create bad blood between the Nasser regime.
Right? In Cairo, right?
In Cairo, to create bad blood between the Nasser regime and the West. And the people in this, the Jews in this spying and sabotage ring were all caught, rounded up, and so was the Israeli controller, the Mossad officer who controlled the ring, who activated the ring, and he committed suicide in a Cairo prison. His name was Max Binet. Max Binet was the very same officer who in 1950 was based in Tehran, because in those days there were secret covert relations between Israel and the Shah. So he operated from Tehran, and he gave Yosef Basri, the underground Zionist, he gave him the maps, the instructions, the information, and the TNT. The TNT. He gave him that. Then Basri was arrested and tried, and it was a proper trial, and among one piece of evidence against him was that the TNT in his car, the traces, was the same as in the bomb site.
Wow, okay.
So it was a pattern of Israel using false flag operations and exploiting local Jews, turning them against their country, and these Jews paid with freedom, sometimes with their life, and they lost their homeland.
Right.
So I'm very, very critical of Israel for the part it played.
Right. Now, so Israel did all this, to ensure that Iraq's Jews migrated to Israel. And as you said, 125,000 of 135,000 went there in 1950. But then how did Israel treat them when they arrived? Because they were building a new state, and they needed people. They were Jewish people, right? Because it's a state for Jewish people. So they wanted to bring in Jews from around the world. So if they wanted the Iraqi Jews so bad, how did they actually treat them when they arrived? This is the second section of the book is about Israel, Iraqi Jews in Israel.
It's a very important question, and the Zionist narrative claims that the Jews were persecuted, and Israel nobly offered them a sanctuary and a haven when Israel was a young state with limited resources, but it went out of its way to welcome them and to absorb them. The truth of the matter is rather different. These Jews arrived by plane from Iraq in Israel, and at the airport they were sprayed with DDT, with infesticide. They were treated like animals, and this was very traumatic. This was what their first experience when they arrived in the Promised Land, and then they were taken to transit camps. The conditions in the transit camps were very, very poor. Hygiene was very poor. The food was terrible. Now, in fairness to Israel, it was 2 years old, and there were also immigration from Romania and from Poland, and it was difficult to cope with so many immigrants. The immigrants from Europe got preferential treatment. The immigrants from the Arab lands suffered a lot in the transit camps, and the ones from Iraq arrived with a suitcase and 50 dinars. That's all. And they were trapped. They couldn't leave. So Israel was struggling, but, and here is the cultural factor that came into play, the Ma'abarot, the transit camp managers, were all European Jews. They didn't have a clue about these people and where they came from. They were an Iraqi middle class, professionals, doctors, judges, lawyers, and they were all treated the same. They treated badly, they suffered, and they were told that they should be grateful for what they were getting. So, having brought these Iraqi Jews to Israel, they were treated very badly, and they struggled a lot to get on their feet.
And your family illustrates that. So your family, your father was a very proud man, very well-dressed man, who had this magnificent home. Even the king, didn't the king take an interest in your mother, or was that your sister? That was the elite of the elite.
It was King Farouk of Egypt.
Oh, okay.
This is in the golden days, when my mother and her mother went to Cairo and to Alexandria in 1947 on holiday, and they stayed in the Hotel Cecile, which was a very posh hotel, and they went to a nightclub, Sans Souci, and there was King Farouk there, and his equerry came and talked to my mother in French, and he said, a very important personality would like to meet you, but not here. Would you come with us to the palace? And my mother replied in French that they would love to go, but they were expecting her husband to come and pick them up. And then she told her mother, we must clear out of here very, very quickly.
So this is where your family was in Egypt and Iraq, right? Absolutely the elite of the elite. And then you go to Israel. What was the effect on your family? Your father came later, right?
Yeah.
So what happened to your proud, wealthy, Arabic-speaking, connected family in the new country of Israel?
My mother, her mother, my two sisters and I left Baghdad in 1950 on a regular flight to Cyprus on their British passport, and my sisters and I were written into my mother's passport, so we were allowed to leave. And after a couple of months in Cyprus, we went by boat to Haifa, So we didn't go to Ma'abara. My mother's uncle, Jacob, who had a villa in Ramat Gan, came and picked us up, and we lived with him for a while. So we didn't suffer as much as the others. But my father was an Iraqi. He wasn't British. And he sold as much of his property as he could. He sold our house for a fraction of its real value. And he was helped by Kurdish smugglers across the border into Iran and then Tehran, and then he joined us a year or so later in Israel. And he has lost most of his property, and he never got back on his feet. So right. He never recovered from the upheaval. And I write, as you know, that in Hebrew, going to Israel is called aliyah, ascent. But for us, it was a very steep yeridah, steep descent to the margins of Israeli society.
And he never really learned Hebrew, right? He never really mastered Hebrew.
No, he never learned Hebrew.
He was in his 50s then? Or
yes,
yeah.
He was 55 when he arrived.
Right. And now your mother, though, as you mentioned, was resourceful, and she had a job at the city, and she was always able to, find a way to help you out. And you had a difficult time, and you talk in the book about some pain. You begin the book with this very embarrassing situation where your father comes up to you and speaks to you in Arabic, but you're in Israel, and it's not cool. Everyone's speaking Hebrew, so you're ashamed in a way, and that sense of shame would stay with you, I think, almost as far as until you're 18, you join the military. Yeah. It seems like at that point, almost at the end of the book, near the end of the book, when you're in the Israeli military, then you're treated as an equal. But up until that point, the teachers are mean to you. The teachers always want to hold you back. You have no motivation in school, and life isn't the way it was in Iraq.
I didn't encounter overt racism. No one said to me, "You are an Iraqi, you are inferior." But it was in the air.
But you felt it.
I felt it. I felt it very acutely. It was in the air. Everything European was considered superior. Everything Arab was inferior and primitive. And Arabic was considered an ugly and primitive language. And I absorbed all that. I internalized all the prejudice. It was only many, many years later, when I was a professor at Oxford, that I learned to read and write Arabic and realized what a beautiful language it is. And Mark is a great linguist. He knows about 8 languages, including Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, Persian.
No, but anyway, we're talking about Iraqi Jews. So then, your father never recovers. He never recovers, and that's one of the saddest aspects of the book is your father is really a broken man, and your mother divorces him, and then he's even more. He lives alone in this one room flat. It's just crushing. But that's the genius of this book, because through the life of your father, we can understand a much bigger story, a much bigger tragedy, and how Arabic-speaking Jews were treated as second-class citizens in the Jewish state. Now, we only have a few more minutes, and then I want to open up to questions. The last part of the book brings you to England, and that in itself is an interesting story. And how you got into university is kind of corrupt too, right? You mentioned that, how you got in. But it was only later in life where you were able to really understand what had happened to you and your family and to other Arabic-speaking Jews. So what was the turning point? It was in the late 60s, right? The Six-Day War, the 1967 war. Was that the turning point for you?
That was the turning point in the Six-Day War, June 1967, was the turning point in Middle East history. It's the turning point in the relations between Israel and the Arab world. And it was the turning point for me personally, because in the mid-1960s, I served in the Israeli army. I did national service. I served loyally and proudly in the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, because in my time it was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Forces. And the Israeli army confronted regular armies of the neighboring Arab states. But after 1967, everything changed, and Israel became a colonial power. Israel trebled its territory. It captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And my little army, its entire character changed. It became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. So my disenchantment with Israel isn't sudden, but that's when it starts.
Okay, but then you're also abroad, so you never went back to Israel.
No.
You left.
And I never served in the reserves. I did military service, came to England.
Right.
I was a history student at Cambridge, and I've never served in the reserves, and I've stayed in Britain until now.
Right. Did they take away your citizenship because you didn't continue to serve the military, or were you able to?
No. It's very, very difficult to. They never take your citizenship away from you, and it's very, very difficult to surrender Israeli citizenship. So I remain with two. I have a dual citizenship. I have an Israeli passport and a British passport.
Right. So, but in a sense, maybe it's easier to criticize Israel from here than being part of that society, right? So you're here, you have some distance, you could see, having your own experience as an Iraqi, and also then having some distance, you're able to be more critical of it.
It's a lot easier to criticize Israel from here, and I get attacked a lot by Israelis, but I'm indifferent, because for me Oxford is the center of the universe.
Okay. Some people would say Cambridge is or London, but that's okay. But let's end on a positive note, though, because you, despite everything, you still have a vision for how Palestinians and Israelis can be at peace with each other.
I have this vision because of my history.
Right.
No other way, because my family and I, Muslim-Jewish coexistence wasn't an abstract idea. It's what we experience every day. We touched it. And I write with some nostalgia about this wonderful world, cosmopolitan world, which was blown away by the cold winds of nationalism in the 20th century. But because I experienced it, I don't look at Arabs as the enemy, but as people, as real people, as a proud and dignified and sensitive people. And I would like to reconstruct that world. Of course, I cannot reconstruct it. It's gone away. It's been blown away. But I know it was possible once, and I think it is possible again. It would be something that. One thing is clear: unless we have the kind of civilized dialogue between minorities and coexistence between Muslims and Jews, we are never going to get past the present impasse.
And you envision a secular democratic state where everyone's equal, whatever the religion.
One democratic state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea,
for all
with
inhabitants.
Equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of religion and ethnicity.
Okay. And on that hopeful note, let's turn it over to the audience. And there's a microphone coming around. We have about 10 minutes, which isn't long. There were a couple hands in the front.
I just wanted to ask to what extent the Arab Jews in Israel had been able to hang on to their culture or wanted to hang on to their culture. Did they have a sense of exile after 1952? And to what extent did they hang on to their culture and still retain that within Israel?
So my generation didn't retain our culture and folklore. We tried to become new Israelis, to be absorbed. And many Arab Jews vote for right-wing parties because they become nationalistic and they want to prove that they have nothing to do, that they have nothing but contempt for Arabs. And I flirted with right-wing ideas when I was a teenager. I only saw the light much later. The division between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews continues to Israel to this day. Although there's been intermarriage, there is still a clear cleavage between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews. But in recent decades, there's been a resurgence of Arab culture and folklore. So you have Israeli singers who were born in Israel, but they sing in Arabic and they have concerts in Arabic. So that's a very positive thing.
Thank you. I saw another hand near the front. Gentleman in the black shirt.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, this was really such a rich conversation. My question to you, Professor Shlaim, is that if I'm not mistaken, the British had quite a bit of influence with the Iraqi regime, at least until the coup in 1958. They must have known of the Iraqi government's actions against the Jewish community in Iraq. Was it a matter that they were unable to do anything or exert some kind of influence to have them stop this? Or were they unwilling to go ahead and do that? I was wondering if you had any comment on that. Thank you.
I'm extremely critical in the book about British colonialism because Britain after the war had the mandate over Iraq and Britain determined the borders of Iraq. Britain chose the political system in Iraq, and Britain imposed a hand-picked ruler, Faisal I, who came from the Hijaz. He was a foreigner. The British imposed him as king in Iraq, and they rigged the referendum. Many referenda have been rigged in the Middle East ever since, but the British were the first to rig a referendum, and there have been a lot of tyrants who play divide and rule. Putin today is the latest example, but the British were the ones who played divide and rule in Iraq. And one of the reasons for Iraqi Muslim resentment of the Jews and the Christians is that the British gave them preferential treatment. So there's quite a lot about British colonialism in Iraq and its the tricks they played on the Iraqis.
Well, also in the book, you say that actually the British are responsible for allowing the pogrom to happen against Jews in Baghdad.
Don't start me on this.
So the British come in for a lot of criticism in the book.
There was a long history of harmony and coexistence, but there was one pogrom in 1941, and I argue at length in the book that the person mostly responsible for this pogrom was Sir Kinahan Cornwallis, who was the British ambassador to Baghdad. My parents hated him, but they couldn't pronounce his name, so they called him Al-Kalb al-Kalb, the dog and son of a dog.
Thank you very, very much. And there's such parallels with today where anybody who has Jews who have empathy with Palestinians have a very hard time, not least in that once progressive Labour Party. You might want to comment on that, but my question is a bit different. It's how does the story of coming from Israel, that there is a nation and all us Jews have origins in the land that is now Israel and Palestine, how does that square with claiming that there's no Arabic nature to Jews if we all have our origins in the Arabic lands of that area?
So the contradiction is could you repeat the contradiction then? The irony?
I mean, my sense, maybe I'm wrong about this, is that the Old Testament of Jews is an Arabic origin culture.
How is it that
Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing? My mother used to wax lyrical about the wonderful Muslim friends that we have. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she looked at me as if this is a very strange question. And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. So Zionism is a movement by European Jews for European Jews. Israelis have never wanted to be part of the region. They always regarded themselves as part of the West. Israel has always refused to integrate culturally and politically and in any other way in the region. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, once said, "It's only as a result of an accident, a geographical accident, that we find us here in the Middle East. Our culture and our values make us part of the West." And to me, that is the problem, because I'm an Arab Jew, I'm part of the region, I want to have open borders and cooperation and with the rest of the region. But the Israelis don't look at it that way. And sadly, Arab Jews in Israel also, as I was saying earlier, also don't want to be part of the region, but look down on Arabs. And this is a problem which is very fundamental, which I would like to overcome.
Thank you. We've got 2 more minutes if there's one more question, or 2 more questions. There's a person in the back and there's a person in the front. We have time for both questions.
Hi. Okay, this is chutzpah, seems we've got such a short time left, but I note your comments and that you seem to prefer the idea of a single state rather than a two-state solution. Let's just say the different opinions are on that. I'm certainly more inclined to what you believe, but one problem is that the mood in Israeli society doesn't seem to be towards that, and the demographics seem to be pointing more towards the right. Do you have any thoughts about how a move towards what you see as an ideal could be attained, given the way things appear to be in this year, 2023?
No. Israel has been moving steadily to the right. It's become more xenophobic. The present government is the most right-wing, xenophobic and overtly racist and homophobic government in Israel's history. There is no way that this kind of government or the present Israeli public would agree to a one-state solution. Israel is an apartheid state. It's a Jewish supremacist state. And Israel is the only member of the United Nations that I know that is officially racist. I'm only talking about my views and what I think. And I used to support a two-state solution, but Israel killed the two-state solution. The two-state, with settlements and with expansion, Israel could kill the two-state solution. It's no longer feasible. All that is left to the Palestinians is a series of enclaves which would make a viable state. So the two-state solution is dead. It's as dead as a dodo. It's as dead as the Oxford dodo, whom I visit regularly in the Natural History Museum. So what's the alternative? For me, the alternative is the one I described, one state with equal rights for all its citizens. I don't think it's remotely possible, but it's a noble vision, and it's what Israel has left by eliminating the two-state solution. As far as I'm concerned, it left only one democratic solution, which is the one-state solution.
Okay, thank you. And it is 8 o'clock, but we could quickly take your question and get a quick question and a quick answer, the woman in the yellow shirt, and then we'll close the session.
I'm interested in your experience, your personal experience, as an Arab Jew, as a Jew that come together as an Arab Jew. I want to ask whether you have a double burden, double pain. You're hurting twice. Your wound is deeper because of this double identity, and you feel displaced linguistically, geographically. How much it affected you as a person who has lost everything, and what is your experience really, you as a person? Thank you.
I've suffered a lot. I've suffered displacement, had to make adjustments in my life. What I take from my own experience is how much more the Palestinians have suffered than I have. The Palestinians were turned into refugees, 750,000. In 1967, Israel captured the West Bank, completed the capture of the whole of 100% of historic Palestine, created another wave of refugees, another 250,000. So Israel is responsible for expelling 1 million refugees. And what I learned in the process of writing this book is the parallel between our experience as Iraqi Jews and being displaced from our homeland, and the experience of the Palestinians of being displaced. So what I take from my own history and my own suffering is the importance of humanity, the importance of avoiding prejudice, the importance of not demonizing other people, and the importance of supporting the Palestinian cause, standing for justice for Palestinians. So that's what I stand for, but I'm not as ardent and active a supporter of Palestinian rights as is my wife, Gwyn Daniel, so I pay homage to her for her commitment to the Palestinian cause.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the conversation. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.